Well, a little plug for the Theosophical Society and their advanced thinking. I mean, this is nice to be able to talk about psychedelics at a place that kind of would embrace this as a potential religious mystical experience, which is what I'm going to be talking about. Before I start my part of the presentation, I've got a short video that would be a good introduction. So if you would please.
What seems to happen in the psychedelic state is that when something is positive, it has the potential to be incredibly positive, to the extent of being euphoric and ecstatic. But similarly, if something is negative, it has the potential to be quite hellish and dysphoric and frightening. Psilocybin is found in magic mushrooms, and it's a compound that is broken down in the body into another compound which is very, very similar to a naturally occurring neurotransmitter in the brain or chemical messenger in the brain, and that's called serotonin. Now, their pharmacology is subtly different, but what's so interesting about this drug is that that subtle difference in its pharmacology confers profound effects on consciousness.
Our first study was published in 2006 in healthy volunteers who received psilocybin or a comparator drug. This was all in a blinded fashion under optimally supported conditions in which they lay down on a couch, had eye shades on, headphones through which they listened to a program of recorded music. They were in the presence of two people with whom they had already developed a trusting relationship. Under those conditions, a high percentage of people end up reporting a constellation of experiences, the most interesting piece of which is that it really falls into a category of something the psychology of religion people talk about as a primary mystical experience.
Analogy that you could use to describe how the drug affects brain activity is either to say that brain activity becomes relatively disordered or disorganized in the state. Another thing that you could say is that it's not entire disorder, that rather it's more like the brain enters a more kind of anarchic state.
It's fascinating. I think one of the interesting implications of this kind of work is that we're biologically hardwired for having these kinds of experiences. It's not just unique to mystics, you know, spending years of meditation in a cave, that this is part of the human biology to have these kind of integrative experiences that can really set the stage and the platform for remarkable personal change.
And our research has really been looking at how it works in the brain. So we've used a number of different brain imaging modalities or brain scanning modalities. One of them's functional magnetic resonance imaging, which uses high field magnets to look at changes in brain blood flow. The brain imaging work that we've done, one of the interesting findings was that there was a really quite marked decrease in brain activity in a particular region of the brain which is overactive in depression. So this region of the prefrontal cortex is typically highly active in depression, and a range of effective treatments for depression all normalize this overactivity in this region of the prefrontal cortex. And psilocybin did exactly that, and it did it very rapidly.
We're running two different trials now at Johns Hopkins. One is in cancer patients who are anxious or depressed secondary to their cancer diagnosis, generally a life-threatening cancer diagnosis. Although we haven't touched their disease process, they still experience the pain. They're still dealing with the fact that they're going to leave their loved ones or their children. In some cases, these are parents of kids who are young. That sadness is still there, but there's also a larger framing of that, and so it's very touching.
There's a growing consensus among scientists that drug laws and prohibition around psychedelic drugs is irrational, it's unhelpful. and potentially it's precluding people who are unwell getting effective treatments, and that's a shame.
These are remarkable compounds with, I think, remarkable implications if we can understand how they work and why they work.
So what I want to talk about today is chemically inducing a mystical experience, because that's what we are able to do. This is basically, we're talking a dose response. So what we can do with a mystical experience, the potential, I want to look at it in kind of a psychotherapeutic view, because that's my area, that's my bent, and I've gotten a lot of people's opinions changed with some of the science that's come out. So I look at it, a mystical experience, for those of you who've had, how many have had mystical experiences here? Okay, so a fair amount have. I'd say more than half. So that's something that can change your life, whether it's something that happens naturally or something that is induced. So it is a way to transcend the present period, the present where you're at. Okay, so it's a way to kind of go outside of yourself. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. Specifically, I want to talk about the use of ibogaine to treat opiate addiction, again through the use of mystical experience, and also psychedelic-assisted therapy for the dying that Roland Griffiths had mentioned earlier in the video. A little eye candy there. And there's no truth to the rumor that I put something in the coffee. Okay, so. What is a mystical experience? I'm quoting from Dr. Roberts' book, which is on the table there to my left. Mystical experiences have the power to reframe thoughts, emotions, and identity. So this is the idea of using a mystical experience to basically change what you're about. And what is a mystical experience? What are the characteristics of a mystical experience? This is what we pretty much agree on. The mnemonic here is pot music. Dr. Roberts' class had come up with that. There's 2 T's. So we're talking about paradoxicality, objectivity, and I'm going to go into detail on this: transcendence, transiency, mood, unity, sacredness, ineffability, and changes. When we talk about paradoxicality, we're talking about the idea that conflicted ideas are presented as parts of a whole, kind of like the dialectic, the yin and the yang. So being able to have 2 contradictory thoughts at the same time. Also, objectivity. Reality is more than the ordinary experience. So normal waking, we're talking about things outside of normal waking consciousness, which from the Western perspective is not a good thing. Transcendence. And when we talk about transcendence, we're talking about transcending your ego, which tends to get in the way of some real work. And those of you that are familiar with therapy, this is one of the things that happens. So the use of psychedelics is a way to discard the ego and to move past it. On transiency, these experiences are short-lived. The M is for mood, positively felt. In the proper setting, you're capable of having a mystical experience, positively felt mood. Unity is this feeling of oneness, that you're not just a skin-encapsulated ego, as Alan Watts talks about, that you're connected to the universe. And some of you have had these experiences, I know, in the audience. Sacredness, the sense of awe, being attached to a greater cause, that you're connected to something and there is something going on behind the curtain, so to speak. Ineffability, we're talking about an experience that's beyond words, something that ordinary words don't necessarily capture. And then changes, we're talking about altered traits as a result of altered states. So the altered states is not the end. That is the way to alter your traits of consciousness and personality. So I look at transpersonal experiences, and I rewrote the famous mantra that Timothy Leary kind of burned into our psyche. Turn on, turn in, tune in, transcend. It all started, at least research-wise, in the United States with the famous experiment at a chapel in Boston, at the Marsh Chapel in 1962. And this is Timothy Leary, Richard Alport, now known as Baba Ram Das, and Walter Pankey. 20 divinity students were given either a placebo or psilocybin. What the conclusion was after the research, those that received psilocybin experienced to a greater extent than did the controls the phenomena described by our typology of mysticism. So in this on Good Friday, in this very charismatic church, listening to a very charismatic preacher speaking, the ones that received psilocybin reliably had a mystical experience, as we just defined. This is an interesting quote from Time magazine. This was 1966. All students who had taken the drug experienced a mystical consciousness that resembles those described by saints and ascetics. So this was before everything kind of turned around. There was a long-term follow-up by Rick Doblin, the president of MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. What he found was that all of the subjects that he was able to contact after the experiment still considered their original experience to have had genuine mystical elements and to have made a valuable spiritual contribution to their lives. So even, we're talking 1991, so almost 30 years, after the initial experience, people were still seeing this as a very powerful mystical experience. Here's a quote: "Something extraordinary had taken place. I felt drawn out into infinity. I felt I was caught up in the vastness of creation, huge, as the mystics say." So again, the characteristics of a mystical experience as I defined earlier. This is the advertisement for the research that was done at Johns Hopkins, kind of groundbreaking research. I thought it would be interesting to kind of see to whom they would appeal for the subjects. Seeking persons committed to spiritual development to participate in a research study of mystical experience, meditation, and spiritual practice. And then in the body, they point out the fact that this is going to be and include the entheogen, psilocybin, which is the use of entheogen describes the religious spiritual use of the psychedelic. It is kind of the more spiritual term for psychedelic. A psychoactive substance found in mushrooms used as a sacrament in some cultures. So this was the ad for the research. I think that the journal title of the research kind of is the conclusion. I think it's really well written. Psilocybin can occasion mystical type experiences having substantial and sustained personal meaning and spiritual significance. So that was the title of the journal article. Here's some quotes, and actually Roland Griffin reports that the subjects felt a sense of sacredness accompanied by feelings of gratitude, awe, love, and peace. They found it inevitable, if not difficult and impossible to describe in words. And then here's the statistics here. 80% report an increase in the sense of well-being, life satisfaction, and positive outlook. And then this change was corroborated by the family. So they took it just outside the people that participated. The family members also corroborated that there was this change. Some quotes on the research. This is by one of the researchers, Roland Griffiths, and he mentions this in the video. Basically, it's biologically normal. We are hardwired for this. So we are built for this. This is something that is not unnatural. Again, psilocybin occasion experiences similar to spontaneously occurring mystical states. This is Dave Nichols, a chemist who has made some of the research chemicals used. And then our very own Harriet DeWitt at the University of Chicago, who is doing psychedelic research. It's time for psychopharmacologists to open their minds and their laboratories to the full domain of human drug experience. So as Rick Doblin said, ladies and gentlemen, the bad acid trip of the 70s is over. Tell your friends, you heard it here. So I want to talk about using ibogaine in treating opiate addiction, which for those of you that are familiar, I'm kind of battling that with some of our clients right now. here is a potential way to change traits through altered states. So what we're talking about basically is ibogaine. And what is ibogaine? It's a psychoactive indole alkaloid that's derived from the root bark of an African plant, the iboga plant. And its use as a transformative agent, it is administered to people with opiate addiction as a way to get them to change and to stop using. So it becomes a transformation agent. The first time we've heard about it was in its use by the Bwiti cult, which is the religious part of the Fang tribe. This took place in West Central Africa and still does. And it was preserved despite European colonialism. And the way, if you are indigenous people trying to preserve your religion, the easiest way to do that is to adopt the religious calendar of the dominant culture and just integrate your holidays in with them. So basically what they did is, instead of Holy Communion, they have the ibogaine experience as a mystical experience as part of the religious ceremony. The Bwiti and the Bwiti cult refers to a superior, a god, if you will, a superior identity, and also this is a sculpture post, that's the fundamental temple system there. And as I said, they use the religious calendar similar to the Catholic calendar and pretty much get left alone. The interesting thing here is that the initiates are given a large dose of ibogaine. So they're actually, as I said, we're talking about dose response. At a large enough dose, somebody's going to get a response for the most part. So this makes it a complete psychedelic religion, the fact that this is part of the experience to get a psychedelic experience. And this is considered to be in moments of greatest illumination, something that should be taken into consideration for the rest of the initiate's life. Very much like baptism, confirmation, that sort of thing. But this is psychedelic. Treating addicts came about when Howard Lotzoff, who recently died in 2010, in a quest for another high, came across ibogaine, and after ingesting it, he found that he had the elimination of his opiate withdrawal symptoms, and then when the trip ended, he didn't feel like using anymore. So he realized something had happened, started working on and developed a protocol that's being refined to this day. So what happens with ibogaine? The curious thing about ibogaine is there's an attenuation of the opiate withdrawal symptoms. Somebody that's in the mental health field, I have people that come in the front door that are looking to detox from using heroin, and they want to go into the psych ward because it doesn't kill you, but you wish you were dead. So the withdrawal symptoms are a way that in many ways sustains the habit. So the withdrawal symptoms is minimized, and this lasts for several days to several months. An oneric life review occurs, very similar to REM sleep. So you end up getting kind of a biographical movie, if you will, of your life. And then there's some evidence, and here's the curious thing, some evidence of reset of the addictive cycle. So something happens here. It's like pressing the reset button. And then another interesting thing is that it's an addiction interrupter. Okay, so it's an interrupter, it's not a substituter, and it's not Suboxone, which is, we're talking about a chemical intervention. So it's an addiction interrupter, unlike the two treatment modalities that are used now. You can divide the ibogaine experience into 3 stages. The first phase, the acute stage, begins 1 to 3 hours after ingestion, lasts typically 4 to 8 hours, and this is the start. This is the panoramic readout of your long-term memory. So you've got this movie playing in your head, a long-term play out of your life. This is followed 48 hours after ingestion and might last from 8 to 20 hours. The biographical material starts to slow down, and it gives you a chance to reflect and kind of connect the dots. The last phase, the residual stimulation phase, 12 to 24 hours after ingestion, lasts from 24 to 72 hours, and you start having return to normal attention. and some people report a decreased need for sleep. So a lot of processing going on here, and you're returning now to baseline. This is done in medically monitored. You have to be very careful with that. So what is happening here? We're not really sure. There's no research allowed in the United States. Ibogaine is a Schedule I drug. So some of the theories are that it is basically facilitating a state of plasticity in the brain. And what happens in this plastic state is the learning is reconsolidated, so you have a chance to relearn things, and I'm a behaviorist, and I know others out there are, Dr. McCracken. Separation of drug-related cues from the obsessive motivational state that becomes part of the addict's nature, this obsessively motivational state that's reinforced by dopamine, the drug-reinforcing pathways in the brain. So in the state of plasticity, in the Ibogaine experience, you have a chance to reconfigure this, the way it's associated. It also diminishes the dopamine, which is the reinforcer in the nucleus accumbens in response to the opioids. And then again, in a very learning theory point of view, it diminishes the acquisition of place preference. Because you have all these things, the body starts responding as you approach the site that you normally use at, and your body starts getting ready for it. So that kind of perpetuates the addiction. This will can potentially break that. And then, and I'm not a chemist, so I wouldn't quite know how to explain this, the incredible thing that it reverses the tolerance by normalizing transmission. So it normalizes, it brings, so this is the reset that we're talking about. So rather than blocking or stimulating transmission, it normalizes it. So that basically is a reset. And then individuals who are successfully detoxed with a single dose of Ibogaine do not go back into withdrawal. So you have no symptoms, you have minimized withdrawal symptoms, you have this biographical life view because you're setting aside this time, this very psychedelic trip with insight, and then you arrive back to baseline after having had that experience. Here's a quote from the Arrowwood Vaults, a good source for information on drugs. I got a glimpse then of the whole universe revolving in a giant circle. And I realized that there is no beginning and no end. It's all a big cycle that we go through until we reach the higher stages of evolution. So what I wanted to do is take a look at the successful treatment of opiate addiction. And again, I had to go outside of the United States to Pangea Biomedics, which is outside of Puerto Vallarta, Mexico. It started with the foundation, the Ibogaine Association, founded in 2000, and then in 2006, the present owner, Claire Wilkins, who herself was a former methadone patient, got cleaned with Ibogaine, and then renamed the clinic Pangea Biomedics. So this is right from the website to give you kind of an idea of the approach. It's a highly individual and sacred experience with one common theme. It's an apparent reprieve from physical and psychological addiction. I mean, this could be right out of Bill Wilson's big book, right? What comes up in Ibogaine treatment, actually, things that are very similar to what comes up in therapy: sexual trauma, unprocessed memories, unmourned grief, relationship dynamics, any kind of transference. The approach what makes this approach different is that it is not based on the disease model that we currently use. So it's not based on the disease model. It is looked at as a journey, a kind of rebirth, kind of a rite of passage that's acknowledged as part of the aftercare. So it's basically used more in the indigenous model than the typical model that we use in therapy. This is Claire Wilkins' quote from the Psychedelic Science in the 21st Century a couple years ago. I was completely perfect and whole, connected to everything. No beginning, no end. A complete sense of true wisdom. So again, the mystical experience that she experienced under Ibogaine. So what MAPS is doing, we learned a lot from the 60s. Everything stopped, as the Vietnam War came to a halt. What we're doing now with what organizations like MAPS are doing is they're sponsoring studies in other countries, and then we're bringing the results back here. So if they won't let us do ibogaine research here, we can use studies in other countries and bring it back here. The same with there's no LSD studies here because of the bad press from the 60s. So now I want to move on to using mystical states in helping people come to terms with the last phase of their life, the end-of-life psychotherapy with psychedelics. Again, from Dr. Roberts' book. Transpersonal states of consciousness can restore a lost sense of wholeness and personal integrity. I mean, imagine you can reliably induce a mystical experience in advance of somebody's death and take them to a different place using it as a transpersonal experience. The first person that talked about using psychedelics in dying was Aldous Huxley, a famous British author. And what he said was, the living can do a great deal to make the passage easier for the dying, to raise the most purely physiological, active human existence to the level of consciousness, and maybe, perhaps even of spirituality. All the pictures in here, by the way, are Alex Gray, who's kind of the psychedelic artist for the community. So how do we view death in Western society? Death's a bad trip, right? It's not a good thing, not a natural part of human existence. What happens when people die? We wax them up, make them look better than when they were alive. Everybody says nice things, and then you put them in the ground, and so it's bizarre. It's medicalized. It's biology over spirituality. It's all about keeping you alive for as long as possible and then making you look nice to rot in a casket. Just my personal point of view. Cast and Collins actually were looking at using LSD as an analgesic in Chicago because they thought the characteristics of LSD might lend itself to being used as an analgesic. Produces a distortion of body images. LSD also alters the body boundaries, and then it interferes with the ability to concentrate. So they thought with these characteristics, it would be a good analgesic. What they found instead was that there was this occurrence of happy, and again, we didn't have words then, oceanic feelings. Does everybody know what oceanic feels like? Okay. So happy oceanic feelings lasting up to 12 days along with relief of physical and emotional pain. That's huge. I did my master's thesis on this as my mother was dying of cancer, 7 years, and if somebody could have used a trip, it would have been my mom. So this is the first time that there was this association noted between transcendent experience and then a relief of physical mental pain. So this is kind of a novel idea, right? You take a transcendent experience, you give somebody a transcendent mystical experience, and it relieves emotional and physical pain. It's not surprising. So this paved way for what came to be known as psychedelic peak therapy. We're talking about 350 micrograms of LSD. The typical street dose is about 80 to 100 micrograms. It's your proverbial one hit. Don't hear any bad stories about LSD anymore because people understand the set and setting. So 350 micrograms, healthy dose. This was at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center. Again, some of the people that were in some earlier studies, Pankey, Kurland, Unger, Savage, and Groff. The basic premise here is the theme of this presentation. That's that a single overwhelming experience can produce a dramatic change in the way the person sees himself in the world. A way to look at it is it's very much like Maslow's peak experience. So you give somebody a peak experience, they transcend their present state, and they change their point of view. The person feels allied to or merged with a higher power, and then they may feel that they're part of a larger pattern. There's a sense of cleansing, a sense of release and joy, and making old woes seem trivial. When you've had this transcendent experience, whether or not there's salt on your potatoes doesn't make any difference. So I propose, and this isn't my novel idea, that psychedelics can be an antidote to medicalized death. It's a way to make it a good trip as Huxley said, to raise the experience of dying to that of a spiritual experience. It's a chance to practice death. When you lose your ego-centered consciousness, ego death is a form of death. And then the mystical experiences are very similar to near-death experiences. So there's a similarity with the white light that everybody talks about. So I want to talk just a little bit and touch on just some general completed and ongoing research. The two big research bodies are the Hefter Research Institute and MAPS. I highly recommend joining MAPS. It's a very good organization that provides seed money. This was recently completed research using LSD in the terminally ill. Once again, it's not in the United States because of the stigma against LSD. So Peter Gasser just completed this in Switzerland. We're waiting for the results to be published, and hopefully the FDA will accept the results of the Swiss study. So it would take some research done in another country and bring it back here. This was recently completed, psilocybin research done at Harvard UCLA, targeting people with cancer that Roland Griffiths had talked about. So what were the results of the study? There's no problems physiologically or psychiatrically. There's no clinically significant adverse events with psilocybin, so nothing unusual happens. And a reduction in anxiety 1 to 3 months after treatment. So we're talking about one dose, and we're talking about an experience that can last for 1 to 3 months in reduction of anxiety. That's what we call the psychedelic afterglow. And then the improvement of mood that reached significance in 6 months. So we're still being processed in the person up to 6 months later. This is taking place right now at New York University School of Medicine Advanced Cancer Study. Stephen Ross is the principal investigator here. What they're looking at is to see what happens to anxiety. That's the outcome variable. And most of the subjects in this research are hallucinogen naive. So they're not experienced. And then they're going to look at depression, pain, quality of life, and then spiritual measures toward disease, progression, and death are the focus. And what are some of the results? These are anecdotal results, not published because it's not completed, obviously. Clinical improvement, a reduction in death anxiety, and in some cases resolution of it, a reduction in overall anxiety and depression, increased spiritual states and practices, and then improvements in the existential meaning in life. Psychedelics can be looked at as existential medicine. They expand the present moment. This research is currently being recruited for. This again is at Johns Hopkins Hospital here. Hefter Research Institute is doing the study, and again, Roland Griffiths, who is in the video, looking at the effects of psilocybin, again, in cancer patients. And the idea here, as you can tell, is focused on providing a mystical spiritual experience to help relieve some of the anxiety and depression around death. So I feel that altered states can lead to altered traits, and there's no good reason not to continue the studies. We're in phase 2 of most of the studies using MDMA and psilocybin. Phase 3 is a big leap in money. So it's not that there isn't the interest. The pharmaceutical companies often are the only ones that have that kind of money. So that concludes my presentation. Any questions?
You heard of the past. I mean, how can they control for what kind of experience someone's going to have on it?
Well, that's a really good question. I did a talk at the Cluster Buster Conference on psychedelic safety. The first thing I would say is set and setting. One of the ways to look at psychedelics in Stanislav Grof's point of view is it's a non-specific amplifier is what he calls it. So if you're in a bad mood, it's going to make it worse. So that's the first thing you need to know. I get called out by the psychedelic community every now and then about somebody that did way too many drugs and is in a bad state, and I work with people that are psychotic for a living, so I aid the community, and most of the time people need to go to the psych ward. But it inevitably ends up the same thing. You know, they had one good experience, and then their lives took a turn for the worse, and so they thought they could take this good experience and superimpose over the bad current experience, and then ends up being a horrible experience, and then they end up, you know, needing to be hospitalized unless you can talk them down. But usually by the point I get called, they've been having a trouble for days. So, any other questions?
Thanks. Bruce, you were talking about the single dose of ibogaine, and I kind of wondered how frequent is the experience that people get those results with one dose? Is that a pretty frequent thing?
Yes, it is. I mean, now, as far as teasing out, are these, some of the people might be kind of chronic or treatment resistant, as the Freudians would say. So they might be at that point, at that stage of change that they're ready to make a change. But oftentimes the experience is so profound and it's so mind-blowing that people are able to kind of connect the dots. So there have been a fair amount of, and we're accumulating the research now, but it's not big numbers because, again, it's dangerous. So using like the clinics in Canada or Mexico, the numbers are small. We'll be getting some information on that. People have had that with LSD too, and there is some research that it was approved looking at using psilocybin to treat alcoholism. And again, if you're familiar with Bill Wilson had used LSD for his depression, as I understand it, and it's in the big book. He was pretty much a proponent of LSD for alcoholics, but the alcoholic protocol, or whatever you want to refer to, the way that they kind of think is not to substitute one drug with another, which is not what's happening, because this is not something you do every day. So, I don't think it'd be limited necessarily to ibogaine. The thing that makes ibogaine unique is that the withdrawal symptoms get eliminated. But if you were looking at maybe alcoholism, LSD or psilocybin could be just as efficacious, I believe. But the thing is to give somebody to give them a good enough dose that they're able to have that experience.
With the negative, getting back to that negative trip, if you're treating people with cancer and who are dying, some of them may be very negative. So how do you control for that?
Well, they might not be good candidates for it.
I mean, do they control for that when they're doing the study?
Sure. I mean, there hasn't been, it's not like it's been hundreds, but years ago, what I was told was one of the bigger problems for psychedelic research, I don't know if it is now, and Dr. Roberts may know, was finding research subjects. Because the misinformation about psychedelics is so pervasive that why would you take a drug that makes you crazy? Well, I mean, people don't really understand it, so.
Bruce, are there any studies that you know of with food addiction?
No, maybe the closest one, they had a study on psilocybin and OCD, which isn't really in that. I mean, as far as when you talk about food addiction, you mean overeating or? No, not that I know of.
We just have a question online that I'd like to ask. Did the mystic experiences triggered by chemicals result in what many feel is the essence of many religions and spiritual practices, namely, to do unto others as you would do unto yourself? I
would say yes. There was after those experiences, people became more spiritual in kind of a global sense. So most definitely, that's the answer is pretty much in the question. Yes.
So the research is mostly focused on ibogaine for addiction and psilocybin for mystical experiences or end-of-life treatment. But I wonder why there hasn't been more research on mescaline, especially considering that in the Native American church there's a large population who uses it routinely without any medical oversight.
Well, I think I had asked one of the researchers, and this more applies to the research of psilocybin, which is, in a sense, part of the answer, I think. A mescaline trip is maybe 16 hours. I can't remember what the window is. And psilocybin is maybe 6 to 8. So if you're doing research, and it's something that goes into overnight or is double the amount of time, it's double the money. So, because when I asked the researcher, it was like a simple answer. And his a dear friend, now deceased, Dr. Andrew Sewell, recently died this year. But what he said was that if you think about it, like psilocybin, then you have to have a psychiatrist, doctor, you have all the hoops that you mentioned with DMT, Dr. Strassman, that paved the way for this whole thing. It is pretty financially burdensome and very rigorous. So if you have something that's short-acting and very powerful and you can do it, that's why you started with DMT, that you're up and down within an hour. So the longer you go, the more it's going to cost. That's why the Ibogaine, they're clinics. You go there for a week, 5 days or whatever. You stay there, so you get your therapy before, during, and after. So I think that's one of the things right now. It's a money thing. If we had money, in my opinion, there'd be a lot more research done, because that leap from phase 2 to phase 3, phase 3 I think starts at 300. Double blind, that's huge, that's a lot of money. So.
Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi tells a story about his daughter who asked him, Abba, when you're asleep, you can wake up. When you're awake, can you wake up more? That's what we're going to be talking about, waking up more. And Bruce's talk about psychedelic experiences that are mystically oriented is exactly what we'll be talking about, largely about mystical experiences. And we'll pick up on Bruce's ideas and go in the direction of looking at spiritual development and religion. So let's take a look at some of the things that I'm looking at. I'm going to propose a new religious spiritual era is developing, largely but not entirely because of psychedelics. And we'll look at the daughter's question at the beginning of the talk and come back to it at the end, and I hope be better informed when we look at it. These are the characteristics then that Bruce mentioned on mystical experiences. I want to particularly look at this one called objectivity, which is also called the noetic sense. It's a sense of getting knowledge, of getting truth somehow. And the slogan or motto, whatever it is that I see of the Theosophical Society, that there's no religion higher than truth, fits right into that, except that there's some odd questions, and that is, are there different types of truth in our ordinary awake state and in mystical states and in other states? Does the sense of truth change from state to state? And is there a sort of rheostat of truthfulness in our mind that sometimes seems to be set very high so that we have an insight that seems to be true, and sometimes it's set very low so we have an insight that doesn't seem to be true? And one of the problems with mystical experiences is that people often have insights that they think, wow, I've had a great insight into the world. This is the way the world is. And it's hard to dissuade them of that. That's not unlike our sense of truth in our ordinary state, because there are a lot of people who are hard to dissuade. And there's a famous example of this that sort of gives caution to everybody. It's from William James, the father of American philosophy and psychology. It's questionably attributed to him, but the point is good whether it's attributed to him or not. He was having a drug experience. I think it was with nitrous oxide. It might have been mescaline. He did both. And he had a wonderful insight, and he wrote it down. And he woke up the next morning and he realized he had a wonderful insight, but he couldn't remember what it was. But fortunately he had written it down. So he went to take a look at what he had written as this wonderful insight into the nature of the cosmos and great understanding. And this is what he wrote. Higamus, hogamus, woman is monogamous. Hogamus, higamus, man is polygamous. Now, that's not necessarily a big insight into the nature of reality, but thinking it is a problem, and this is a common problem, right? This is a common problem in looking at psychedelic experiences. Now, we'll pay particular attention to the sense of unity that is transcending oneself and be feeling united with something else, and a sense of sacredness, which also seems to be built into the human mind somehow. Okay, this is one of the three big ideas we're going to be talking about. I've added the color in there because we're going to pick up those ideas in a couple of slides. This is the mystical approach to understanding religion. Indeed, isn't religion above all, before it is doctrine and morality, rites and institutions, religious experience? And isn't religious experience in its highest form mystical experience? So what we're looking at now is the possibility of producing this experience, not because you've been doing meditation for 40 years, not because you're just lucky, but being able to produce it more or less reliability reliably, and that more or less is a real constraint on this. This is a graphic version of this idea. It reads from the bottom up. So the mystical experiences, which I'll call primary spiritual experiences, that has lots of other names, and most religions seem to have their own version of this. People who've had these experiences then are likely to make beliefs which try to make sense of the primary religious experience. They develop rituals to recreate or honor the experience. Ethics, which asks the question, once you've had this experience, how do you incorporate it into your life? Because it isn't just the experience that counts, it's its sustainability. And finally, organizations that house the beliefs, rituals, and ethics. So we'll look at each one of these as they come along. Before that, this is the second big idea, and that's that Western religion is going through a major transition now, parallel to the one that we went through 500 years ago. Before about 1500, in Western religion basically meant doing certain rituals, going to church on Sunday, saying certain prayers, observing feast days and holidays and so forth. That it was a religion of doing things. When the printing press came along, this changed us into our current transition of a word-oriented religion. And this is spotted very nicely by Karen Armstrong, a former nun who has written, this is her pile of books, I'm giving you an idea of what she's written, on religious topics. And she points out that when the printing press came along, suddenly the printed word became the center of religion. And this was the big transition that happened during the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, because the word then became available for people to read themselves. Before that, actually, a lot of priests couldn't read. It was a very specialized field because books were so rare. So after pointing out the importance of the printed word, she says, instead of trying to get beyond language, Protestants would be encouraged to focus on the precise, original, and supposedly unchanging word in print. So print started our current 500-year period of religion. Now, notice it says democratizing text. So that's what the printing press did. It democratized text and made people in general able to read it. Now, at that time, of course, not many people could read. And one of the reasons that public education got going was so that people could learn to read, basically learn to read the Bible, and then this gave rise very much to the rise of science and the use of understanding religion in terms of words. For example, if we ask somebody his religion or her religion, we don't expect the person to say, these are the rituals I follow. We expect the person to say, these are my beliefs. See, we're in a cognitive, word-oriented, text-oriented period of religion. So the printing press democratized text. What I'm proposing is that we're having another democratization going on right now, and the mystical experiences that Bruce described are that, and the place of the printing press is taken by the entheogenic use of psychedelics. Also other techniques. I'll talk about more of that in a minute. This book, Psychedelic Drugs Reconsidered, Lester Grinspoon and James Bacalar were both on the faculty of Harvard Department of Psychiatry, and Grinspoon is a specialist in schizophrenia, and Bacalar is a doctor of jurisprudence. So what they did is combine all the research and look at them from a medical and legal perspective in this book. This book came out in 1972, and unfortunately it still is the standard in the field because there have been such a political social resistance to psychedelics, which is now overcoming it. And what they did is basically look at all this research, and in the section on religion say, it should not be necessary to supply any more proof that psychedelic drugs produce experiences, there's that word experiences, that those who undergo them regard as religious in the fullest sense. So here's another big idea, the idea that psychedelics are democratizing access to mystical experiences, that mystical experiences are one of the roots of religion. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying the only root. It's one tributary into the religious river. And entheogens are the use of psychedelics. And finally, it's been picked up by the Oxford English Dictionary, so that makes it an official word now. And it's typically a substance of plant origin ingested to produce a non-ordinary state of consciousness for religious or spiritual purposes. And sometimes people take them for non-religious or spiritual purposes and yet have a mystical, sacred experience for it. So the purpose may be actually there or not. Now, Bruce talked about the research done at Johns Hopkins Medical School, and I want to point out two items that came out of that research. And one is they did a follow-up study 14 months later from the original study, and there's the down there the reference to it. And Griffiths, who we saw on the tape, the guy with the nice curly gray hair, is the major researcher in it. And one of the things they asked was, how meaningful was the experience to you? And you could say not at all meaningful or moderately meaningful. Two of the options were one of the top 5 most meaningful experiences in my life, and finally, the most meaningful experience in my life. The average age of the volunteers, I really like that Hopkins calls them volunteers, not subjects or patients. I mean, that's a nice way to put it. It's 40 to 45 and a half. So this is a mature group. It's a very selected group and should not be generalized to the general population. They screened them very carefully. Griffiths mentioned that. Because they wanted to get a healthy, normal group to see if they would have mystical experiences. And 11% of that group said it was the single most significant, meaningful experience in their life, and 58%, including the 11, said it was one of the top 5. And for spiritual significance, a third. Imagine being able to produce the single most significant experience spiritually in one's life in a laboratory or in a retreat center. And 67%, again including the 33, said it was one of the 5 most spiritually significant experiences in their life. So this is that transition that's happening now, the democratization of spiritual mystical experiences. And here's our main idea here. We're going to use this and go through each one of these little boxes and look at some examples of where this is turning up in our culture. Let's start with beliefs. In books by Stanislav Grof, who's the world's expert in psychedelic psychotherapy, originally it was published as Realms of the Human Unconscious, and the same text is now published as LSD Doorway to the Numinous. He reports, even hardcore materialists, positively oriented scientists, skeptics and cynics, uncompromising atheists, and anti-religious crusaders, such as Marxist philosophers, who did his original research in Prague under communist control, suddenly became interested in spiritual research after they confronted these, that's the perinatal birth level, in themselves. So here we have the transition happening now with psychedelic psychotherapy. Another beautiful example of this comes from Benny Shannon. Benny is a well-known cognitive psychologist in European circles. He went on vacation to Brazil, took some ayahuasca when he was there, and being a cognitive psychologist, started to ask all the questions that cognitive psychologists will ask about this type of experience. How are my thoughts changing? What am I thinking about my thoughts, and so forth? And he did a beautiful example of a field that I think needs to be done, and that's the crossing of psychoactive materials, in this case ayahuasca, with an academic discipline. And he hybridized them into this book called The Antipodes of the Mind. And he had actually several hundred ayahuasca experiences over the years, interviewed Brazilians who were native Brazilians, European Brazilians, North Americans, and Europeans to find out what they thought about the experience and to try to make sense of this in terms of cognitive psychology. And what he says is that personally, if I were to pick one single effect of ayahuasca that had the most important impact on my life, I would say that before my encounter with the brew, I was an atheist. When I returned back home after my long journey in South America, I no longer was. People generally find their assumptions confirmed with ayahuasca, but there are some conversion experiences. Houston Smith, we'll talk about in a minute, who I last saw speaking here, is one who had his idea of the universe confirmed with one of his LSD experiences. Here are two books that are available. The one on the right, Higher Wisdom, is a collection of people who have 30, 40, and 50 years experience with psychedelics, and you can see the subtitle is Eminent Elders Explore the Continuing Impact of Psychedelics, and Houston is the next to the last one mentioned there. This is a book that he wrote, Cleansing the Doors of Perception, playing off Aldous Huxley's book, The Doors of Perception. He wrote this to clarify and summarize his ideas on psychedelics. I want to zoom in on the subtitle there, The Religious Significance of Entheogenic Plants and Chemicals. And if you've had a course in the world religions, chances are that's the book you use. That's the most used book in world religions. And there's a picture of Houston who's speaking right down there by the table, several years ago right here. Now let's take a look at the second box, rituals. Where are we seeing psychedelics influencing current rituals? Remember again, we're saying that this is one of the big transitions that's going on, that before the 1500s, religions were generally communal practice. Now we're getting individual readings. And what are we finding out now for primary spiritual experiences? How are we getting some rituals in that? Now, this is the slide I meant before. Entheogens are just one of many mind-body spiritual practices to produce mystical experiences. So this is the one we're focusing on today, but there are lots of types of meditation, lots of types of yoga, lots of breathing routines, vision quests, and so forth. So we're looking at a very narrow slice of a very rich pie. And so we're looking at this particular method of producing mystical experiences, but these other methods are also contributing to this big transition that we're going through in religion now. There are three sorts of information on this. One is indigenous rituals. So we have Native American and many Native South American uses of psychoactive plants religiously. And the question is, how adaptable are they to our society? Should we just try to do the same thing, or do we have to think, well, this is the way our society works, and so we have to sort of figure out the way that we might do them. Accumulated knowledge from the 1960s and 70s about how to do and not do psychedelics. Bruce mentioned that there are many fewer bad trips now because people know they will amplify what's going on in your mind, and you want to be in the right mindset and in the right location for a psychedelic experience. And finally, experiment-based leads. The Johns Hopkins studies are the absolute paradigm in that. This is my slide for indigenous adaptation. This is from a growth center in Brazil called Ayahuasca, and he holds like 2-week workshops for about a dozen to a dozen and a half people. And this is the house that it's held in. You can see up here a painting. And these are not trees on the outside of the window. These are very beautifully organized stained glass and clear glass windows. It's like living in an anthropology museum dedicated to psychedelics when you're there. And the building is made out of pink granite. The leader there, Luis Luna, who was a Colombian and now a Brazilian, actually teaches Spanish in an economics school in Finland. And he wanted to build this big, beautiful building and have a wonderful pine log ceiling, and nobody in Brazil knew how to do it. So he brought down a whole construction crew from Finland to build this wonderful pine log ceiling on this. It's a beautiful place. So this is an example of one type of adoption. There are other types where you go to the jungle and you live in a hammock. So we haven't worked out what's best for what person under what situation. This is the Marsh Chapel where the Good Friday experiment was taken, and that's the room where the experiment took place. So this is another adaptation of trying to use psychedelics. Actually, the people in the study were down in sort of the basement of the church, and sound brought down the lecture and the music. And this was on a Good Friday experiment. And these were seminary students from Andover Newton Theological Seminary. So, of course, they would be very primed to have a religious experience on Friday afternoon in the basement of a church. So, again, that's not generalizable to a full population. And finally, this is the session room at Johns Hopkins. The people are screened. They spend about 10 to 12 hours with two monitors, Mary Cosimimo and Bill Richards. It's a nice living room-like room with a rug on the floor and pictures and so forth, because the setting is so important. And all the research that's now being done is being done in this nice, calm living room setting rather than a sort of stale hospital lab location. So this gives us the possibility of experimental religious studies. So all the universities now that have religious studies could start to do experimental studies to give their students experiences that would help them understand the mystical aspects of their own tradition as well as the mystical aspects of other traditions, and see this common core running across religions. Okay, let's look at ethics. There's an excellent book called Quantum Change. William Miller was a psychiatrist at the University of Arizona specializing in alcoholics. And one of his clients came to him and said, "Dr. Miller, I had this wonderful experience and I've stopped drinking." And he thought, well, good, you know. And then his daughter, who was a teenager going through sort of nasty teenagerhood, suddenly changed. And he wondered, what's going on here? So he put an ad in the paper to ask people if they've had these life-changing experiences. And he got 50-some responses. And he and his co-author interviewed them to find out what was going on in their lives. And they found they fell into two categories. One were getting an understanding, cognitive understanding of yourself and your role and how you're influencing other people. And the other was mystical experiences. This book looks at both of those. And mystical experiences, he looked at values. Now, actually, he looked at 50 values, and I've only got 5 of them here. He asked the people, now this is after they've had the experience, looking back at the way you were before the experience and the way you are now, how do you see your values? And just to give you an example here, before, men reported wealth as being the major motivator, and afterward, spirituality. And for women, family before, and growth afterwards. And the second, before that, men was adventure. Boy, that sounds like TV, doesn't it? Okay, and afterwards, personal peace. And for women, independence and self-esteem. So there are 50 of these values, and this is one of the big things that happens during mystical experiences, are value shifts. Now, not everybody and every mystical experience results in this. Some people have a blowout mystical experience on Saturday afternoon and go back to the old grubby selves on Monday morning, and some people change. So why some people, why not others? What accounts for that difference? Now, Stan Groff, again the psychotherapist of LSD psychotherapy, reports deep reverence for life and ecological awareness are among the most frequent consequences of the psycho-spiritual transformation that accompanies responsible work with non-ordinary states of consciousness. What it means, non-ordinary states of consciousness, a psychedelic psychotherapy. So here we see that value shift away from what's in it for me, from the I, me, mine orientation, toward concern for family, groups, the whole world, and even the whole cosmos. So when one's identity is transcended, one's values are also transcended. This is an interesting one. In the study that they did at Johns Hopkins, the follow-up study, there was something called the Persisting Effects Questionnaire. And embedded in that were 8 items to measure altruism. That is, how willing are you to help other people? And as Bruce mentioned, they not only got the results from volunteers, but also family members and friends, so they could check it out that it just wasn't biased reporting. And the Ritalin was the fake treatment, and out of a possible score of 100, it was on a Likert scale from not at all like my experience to extremely like my experience. If all subjects had all said very much like or identical with my experience, that would give 100. So the Ritalin group was better by 19%, and the psilocybin group by 44.5%. This is particularly interesting because this is in a mature group. Personality characteristics seldom change after the mid-20s, and yet in this case, they did change. And another one, which I noticed on the Theosophical website, is open-mindedness. And open-mindedness also went through the same transition, is that people having had mystical experiences become, not only in this case, more socially responsible, but more open-minded. Let's look at organizations now. This is probably the weakest of the 4 boxes, but there are some things that are going on. American Buddhism has its roots, its recent roots, largely in psychedelics. And Tricycle, which is the Buddhist Review, did a survey of its members, well, in fact, anybody could respond to it, on the role of psychedelics and Buddhism. The 89% were engaged in the Buddhist practice, 89% of the people who responded. 43% had taken psychedelics. A lot of Americans who become interested in Buddhism have a mystical experience with psychedelics and then think, is there some other way to get into this without such, well, I'd say psychedelics are like diving off the diving board into a pool or into a lake, and meditation is like wading in. So they say, well, I want to wade in now. I don't want to, I've seen what's out there. Now let me get into it in a slightly more controlled way. 40% said that their interest in Buddhism was sparked by psychedelics. 59% said psychedelics and Buddhism do mix. 41% said they do not mix. 71% said psychedelics are not a path, but they can provide a glimpse of the reality to which Buddhist practice points. And this book called Zigzag Zen is a book of interviews with American Buddhists looking at their psychedelic backgrounds. The best known, of course, is the Native American Church, and this is a book by Houston Smith and Reuben Snake. It says, The Triumph of the Native American Church. That title was chosen shortly after the Supreme Court ruled in favor of letting Native American Church use peyote as a sacrament, and Congress also passed 2 laws, one called the Restoration of Native American Religion Freedom. Ayahuasca is the hot one right now, the tea from Brazil. I've had ayahuasca 4 times. What I really learned was it's what the word putrid means. It really is awful. And usually when it's given, they give you a piece of ginger or a piece of lime or something or lemon afterwards to take the taste out of your mouth. There are 2 ayahuasca churches in the United States, União de Vegetal and Santo Daime. União de Vegetal is centered in New Mexico. They had their tea shipped in, which of course was caught by customs as an illegal substance because it has DMT in it, the Rick Strassman's drug. And rather than just lie down, they sued the customs to get it back. The local 3 judges decided 2 to 1 in their favor. The Drug Enforcement Administration appealed to a bench trial in Denver, and the Denver judges decided in favor of União de Vegetal. It was appealed to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court decided 8-0 in favor of the church, and the reason it wasn't 9-0 is because the hearing had been held, and Judge Roberts came in to take the new place, so he couldn't vote on hearings he hadn't had. Now, what they actually decided, they sent it back to the Denver court. Now, when the Supreme Court tells you 8-0, you better reconsider this. That's a very strong message. And now they're able to import. Santo Daime, as a church going in Oregon, they have also appealed and are getting have got permission to use ayahuasca as a sacrament. There are also a lot of illegal churches, but these are the 2 legal ones. So this is a summary of what we were talking about here. The figurehead for this big transition, of course, is Gutenberg, and that's R. Gordon Wasson. Wasson was a New York banker who got interested in psychoactive mushrooms and has written several of the major books. He's now deceased, on psychoactive mushrooms. If you're a book collector, you know his books. He had them so artistically, craftfully made that they are collector items to book collectors. And the price has gone up on them a lot. Well, the icon, of course, is the Gutenberg Bible, standing for all the printed text, and Amanita muscaria mushrooms. I've just chosen that one. That's the pretty one. But that is one of the psychoactive mushrooms. What got democratized with Gutenberg, of course, the printed word, and with psychedelics, primary religious experience. The route to knowledge changes. It's now seen as reading, study, thought, cognitive processes. The new route is mystical experience, that is unitive consciousness. And let me point out, I'm not saying that experiential religion will replace text religion or become another layer on top of it. Just as text religion did not replace rituals, and we still have rituals, we still have text, and now we have another layer on the cake of mystical experience. Spiritual knowledge currently is dominantly belief, doctrine, dogma, creed, ideology, so forth. And under the new transition would be unmediated direct perception, the mystical experience that Bruce described. The main academic disciplines change from theology and philosophy to biology and psychology. Ethical action, now it's the Decalogue and treat others the way you would like to be treated. And on the ethical issue now, we see transpersonal, that is beyond self-interest. The altruism scale is an example of that. And finally, education, religious education, basically now is reading, understanding, and talking about the sacred texts. And in this case, it becomes experiencing transitions. So there's the big idea that the others feed into. So what are we going to tell Zalman Schachter's daughter when she asks the question? Okay, when you're awake, can you wake up even more? Yeah, I think we can. And clearly not every mystical experience causes people to be awake. And not every psychotechnology, mystical experiences brought about by all this whole range, result in mystical experiences. And a lot of people have them, mystical experiences, and go back to being themselves. So all these connections are not always, sometimes, under the right conditions. And what we need to know is what are those sometimes, what are the right conditions, why does it work for some people some of the time, and somebody else the other time, or work for some person at one point and then not the second time. All those questions need to be looked at, but they allow us to look at these in an experimental way. So religion changes from being just sort of armchair philosophy about text to being based on experience. So we can tell the daughter, we're making progress in that way. Here's her question. When you're asleep, you can wake up, right? But when you're awake, can you wake up even more? That's where I think we are right now. Thanks for letting me talk about my favorite topic to talk about and see if we've got some comments, questions.
What do you think psychedelics actually do to the mind that makes it have this insight? I see it as kind of a an overlaid filter on the brain that it seems to remove. And that once you're over the thing, over the experience, the filter of society, of the consensus reality seems to take over again slowly. And it's kind of a battle to keep it going.
That certainly is true for a lot of people. Again, this is one of those sometimes for some people, not always for other people questions. And we don't have a society that's very good in supporting people afterwards, after mystical experiences. So a lot of people may be temporarily influenced and then sort of wander back to being their own selves when they go back to their jobs and their families and so forth. And what we need is social institutions to embed people and support people in that direction. Little by little, I think we're getting that. But I think that's the direction we really have to go in. And to see this as a normal, but unfortunately, quite rare occurrence. But to recognize that this happens, and these experiences are real experiences. And as Bruce said, our brain somehow is built to have this. And a couple interesting questions come out of that one is that why has our brain evolved to have mystical experiences? Now, not everything that evolves is beneficial. In fact, most changes that happen turn out not to be beneficial. Okay, they're dropped along the way. But apparently this one is. So what's going on there? And if one is working with a creationist, and the question says, the person believes, well, God created the brain, then you can ask, well, why did God create our brains to have mystical experiences? I've been sneaking around waiting to pull that one for a long time and haven't been able to. I don't know. Yeah.
What would these institutions, these supports look like?
I think there would be a couple type of institutions. First, there would be medical psychotherapeutic institutions. I think the way to approach this is to have a company whose service is providing screening, preparation, the experience, and integration for the experience on a psychotherapeutic basis. And probably the people who are sent there would be sent there by mental health professionals. The psychedelic therapy view is very different from the psychedelic religious view. But for the religious view, I should think that there could be a separate church that would take this over. I can imagine a religious order or a guild taking this on, because then they would be professionally prepared and would know how to do it and make the sort of services available. In the academic world, I can imagine, let's say, a consortium of universities in the Chicago area that would have this type of center. There's a whole area to go on cognitive development and problem solving that we haven't gotten into today, but that would be a direction to go on that. So there would either be a big organization with sort of lots of little divisions to do this, or another sort of separate little organizations. From the few nuns that I've had in my classes over the years, I think they would be most of them really good guys. They're very loving, supporting, warm people, and that's one of the characters that's needed in the preparation. MAPS is doing a professional training group right now, and with the expectation and hope that they will be able to get approval to do more research in the near future, and these will be the experiential guides to go through it. But again, just because somebody is a psychiatrist or a priest doesn't mean the person is qualified to lead a session. So it needs a lot of practice in that.
My question is coming from somebody who knows nothing about this, so it may not make any sense. But it's the difference between the spiritual pathway, for me, is, kind of when I'm ready for something, it's there. It happens and it's there. And I'm not actively seeking it. This seems like more of an active seeking of something, and I don't get the congruence between where an individual is with their own development and something that's actively sought and use of a drug to get there. Does that make sense?
Oh, definitely. And
Okay.
you're raising one of the main questions in the area.
Okay.
When is this right for who, basically, is that question. Now, it could be, I mean, you can think about this by saying, well, if a person wants to have a drug experience, to have this experience, that is readiness. I mean, you can interpret it that way. Or you can say that the people, not everybody has a mystical experience, and those who are ready are the ones who have it, and the ones who are not ready are the ones who don't have it. So that's a way to get into it. And so, I mean, that's largely, there's a question behind that. It's even a much more difficult question, and I think will never be resolved. And that's, are drug-induced mystical experiences genuine mystical experiences, or are they fake somehow? And the arguments on that always come down to people confirming their assumptions. So what are you going to say about that? Now, there's an interesting other way of looking at that. If they are real mystical experiences, and the Good Friday experiment suggests this, I mean, this is like, it affected these people's, actually these clergy views of their work over a quarter century later. One experience given once had this a life-changing effect on them. The other one is that if it's a fake experience, it still can be a good learning experience. For example, we use simulations in practically all teaching. So you could say, well, this is not a, quote, religious experience, this is a good simulation. And if you do this experience, you'll have not a real, full-blown, absolute, genuine mystical experience, but you'll have a good approach to it. You'll have a sense of what it's like. And just as in practically all professional training, there's the simulation that's used in training. So that could be considered a spiritual simulation.
Did you have a personal religious experience due to these?
Yes, several times. Much to my surprise. My background is a very rational Connecticut Congregationalist, okay? And mysticism had no room in our church at all. It wasn't anti-mysticism, it was a very cognitively oriented theological church. And much to my surprise, I was doing psychedelics for the fun of it, and had an experience that I had never thought of or had before, and done several subsequent times. But that first time was the eye-opener.
But it doesn't really matter if it's a fake mystical experience or a real one if the results in people's lives are substantial and in the positive direction.
Yeah,
So,
that's
and
right.
that's why it doesn't really matter if the question's really ever answered.
No, unless people think, well, this is a fake, so I'm going to just go back and be my own self.
Oh.
People could rationalize around that way.
Okay. Oh, they wouldn't take that experience as something to move forward in your life.
Well, some would and some wouldn't, and that's the problem. The question is sustainability.
Okay.
I mean, the importance is not to have the experience. The importance is to use the experience to do something with your life. And that's the sustainability issue. Oh, let me give you a little ad here again. There's an article by Roger Walsh, or a chapter in here by Roger Walsh, who is a psychiatrist. In fact, he edited that book called Higher Wisdom on the sustainability question. You just don't have the experience and then go back to be yourself. And this is that question of social support. We don't have a lot of social support, although more than there used to be, but most of the support is sort of like within restrictive religious organizations and so forth. So he looks at that question of how do you take these experiences and do something with them. You don't end with the experience. Actually, and several people point out correctly that the difficulty is not the experience. The difficulty is doing something with your life after the experience. And that's what really counts. And that's the work. Okay, so having had that insight, now what do I do? So, yeah, that's that sustainability problem is, well, a lot of you are mental health professionals, and you know that. You've had clients who have great insights, and then they don't change their lives. Okay, and how do you get them? How do you get them to do that? That's the question.
Say, Tom, can you talk a little bit about placeboing?
That's one of my horses to ride. Yes. Well, I can say psychological research, but all research there, is the placebo. And the placebo is chosen because it has no effect, or should have no effect. And yet, about a third of the people who have the placebo will report that they are better. And you can actually, for physical symptoms, often see they really are better. I mean, they're not just being, nice patients saying, "Thank you, doctor, I feel better," that they really are better. Okay, so when we have one of those events come up, we say that's the placebo effect. Now, the placebo is chosen to have no effect. And then we go ahead and we attribute the effect to something that's chosen because it has no effect. There's a logical problem in there somewhere, and that is a very logical problem. And so I think instead of talking about the placebo effect, we should call it the placebo ability or natural healing ability. And the question that comes up then is, if we look at spontaneous remissions, and there's a whole field of spontaneous remission, and also just sort of generally improvement, they often have to do with shifts in mind-body states, sometimes mystical states, sometimes just your life is suddenly going better, and you're not under distress in your relationship, you're not under stress in your work, and you're able to feel better because of that. So I think that we should start talking about the placebo ability and call it placeboing. And we can ask, how does placeboing vary from one mind-body state to another? By the way, I use the phrase mind-body state rather than state of consciousness, because consciousness is a very ambiguous word. So if you want to think state of consciousness, that's okay, but I think mind-body is more specific, yeah. That's one of the funny insights that happens when you start using different mind-body states, different cognitive processes. You think about things differently.
Are there any factors that either you're aware of or that are supported by data that make anyone more likely to have a mystical experience on psychedelics as opposed to just a relatively ordinary trip?
Yes, and this falls into two categories, the psychotherapeutic use and the other uses. In the psychotherapeutic use, Stan Groff has developed two levels of psychotherapy. At a low to moderate dose, the idea is to bring up material from the unconscious that's been repressed, and then you process it with your psychotherapist just the way other material you would process. So it may take, several sessions, lots of sessions to work through a traumatic experience. Now the other one is the peak experience psychotherapy. Is where this comes up. And the big variables here are dose, and some people are extremely resistant to psychedelics. They have very, very tight ego control. And one of the things that makes psychedelics work is the willingness to give up ego control temporarily and let the psychotherapist sort of take over the ego functions. But some people are very resistant to that. And those are the people who usually have to have very large doses. So the dose is one. What was the rest of the question? Was it variables? Yeah, okay. So with the high dose, with the high dose sessions, it's the session itself. Also, it's very important to have a good therapeutic rapport with the psychiatrist or other mental health professional, whoever it is that's got that going. Music is often used. In the slide that I showed you of the Johns Hopkins session room, you notice the client was lying down on a couch. He had blindfolds on and earphones. And the purpose is to direct the attention inward. Otherwise, they get caught in, watching the walls move and, all that stuff. So you want them to direct the attention inward. And that's what the blindfolds do. The music is chosen. They have a standard CD that they use in all sessions to try to encourage a mystical experience. So the Magnificat, for example, sort of is right at the peak of this time. And so all those things fit together so to sort of prepare that. And also in the preparation sessions, the volunteers will say, well, these are the kind of things that might happen to you. So when they happen, it isn't like really scary. You think, oh, what's happening? You think, oh, that's such and such. And you can just let it happen. And the people who are able to relax, it's like, well, relax your mind to float downstream, as the Beatles call it. If you have that ability, that helps a lot. in both psychotherapy and religious things. So, and then again, this will vary from person to person depending on what's going on in your life. So that was one of the real problems with psychedelics. You give someone a standard dose and you expect a particular effect, and give it to the same person 2 weeks later and you get an entirely different effect. I mean, what are you going to do with a drug like that? I mean, just completely unpredictable. And then they realize that it's that psychomagnifier, amplifier thing that's going on. It's amplifying whatever's going on.